Welcome to the Future Takes series, where we've been asking people how we might achieve a more reconciled island of Ireland in the years ahead. With me today is a woman who has been at the forefront of many of the great human rights cases on the international stage. She is a graduate of UCD, she is a graduate of King's Hinds, and she is a graduate of Cambridge. Caoilinn Gallagher, you're very welcome. Caoilinn, you have been living in the UK for upwards of 2 decades, in and around 2 decades at this stage. What sense of Irishness had you personally brought to the United Kingdom with you when you moved there 20 plus years ago?
I'm not sure I'd really thought about it too much before I was away. And I think that's probably the same for a lot of members of the Irish diaspora abroad. Often don't necessarily think about their Irishness until you're away. But I think in the 2 decades that I've been living primarily based in London and then doing a lot of international work and back here in Ireland quite a lot too, I have started to think very differently about identity and what it is. A very practical example is I've got 3 children who are deeply Irish, consider themselves Irish. They are Irish. My husband's English, and they are Irish and British and both, and very proud of both of their identities. But it does mean I've got children with very Irish names, but with, very London accents. And I do remember thinking as a child, when people who were friends of mine when I was growing up, who would have cousins who came over from England for the summer, and they would describe themselves as Irish and they had Cockney accents or they had Liverpudlian accents. I do remember thinking, but they're not really Irish. They're not Irish in the same way that I am. And I don't think like that anymore. I think Irishness is multi-layered. And in the same way that I think in the time when I've been based out of Ireland, there's been a growing understanding about Irishness when you have immigrant communities coming and settling in Ireland and becoming Irish. Similarly, we need to think quite differently about diaspora communities. And Irishness comes in many shapes and forms and colours and accents.
I want to talk about your work in the area of reproductive rights for women on this island. And I think it's important that we point out, on this island, you were involved in the repeal of the 8th Amendment and also in the repeal of the abortion laws in Northern Ireland. The women who were involved in that were an all-island group.
Yes.
How did identity play into their interactions with each other?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think that this is one of many examples that I've seen where, particularly in post-conflict societies, you quite often get other issues where people coalesce around that issue and suddenly the borders and the lines melt away. And that was absolutely something which I saw in that reproductive rights work. And there was a group called the London Irish Abortion Rights Campaign who worked together on attempting to achieve greater reproductive freedom for women on the island of Ireland. And we worked together with this group on the Repeal the 8th campaign, but also worked together on the North is Next campaign, which you might remember. And there really was no distinction between the experiences that women and girls were having north of the border or south of the border, because the experience, bottom line, the experience was very similar. And one of the really moving things was that in all of the cases in which I acted, the women received great support where there was no distinction, whether they were receiving letters of support from Dublin or Belfast or Cork. They were getting letters in and letters of support and solidarity, which just reflected their experience and didn't reflect their geography and where they happened to be from.
With Britain and Northern Ireland not part of the European Union, what can we learn from that in terms of finding these umbrella groupings or these connections that perhaps do not exist post-Brexit?
I think one of the lessons which I would take from that example about reproductive rights is that when people are focusing on an issue which isn't about the conflict and isn't about the geography, a lot of the differences can melt away.
We can't ignore the past. And I'm thinking in particular about, you acted for the victims of the families of the victims of the 7/7 bombings in London. From that experience, what would you suggest is a useful way of using the past to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I often hear people use that phrase, the past is a different country, as if it's a reason for not looking back and instead only looking forward. And I actually think in order to look forward, it's critical that you do look back and you take lessons from what's gone wrong before and what's happened before. I mean, my experience acting for the bereaved families of the 7/7 London bombings was a very moving and difficult one. You had there a completely indiscriminate terrorist attack in London, which killed people of all colours, creeds, nationalities. And one of the issues which was very important for us working with the bereaved families and with the survivors from the outset was thinking about how we could humanise the dead and recognise that, rather like that alphabet of women with the reproductive rights cases, behind every single name there was a person with a very vibrant life who'd been snatched from this earth in a premature way. So we proposed to the coroner, to Dame Heather Hallett, who's the coroner in the 7/7 inquests, that we should actually start the whole inquests into the 7/7 bombings with a series of pen portraits where people could pay tribute to their loved one in their own way, in their own form of words, and that would put the human at the heart of the process. And since then, that's now become something which routinely happens in inquests across England and Wales, and now in Scotland and Northern Ireland too. Now, I think in the context of the Troubles, we obviously saw an ill-fated attempt by previous UK government to adopt an approach to legacy inquests, which was profoundly problematic, rightly condemned by the United Nations, the European Union, by the Irish government, and by a very wide range of human rights NGOs and experts internationally. I'm very pleased to see that that's gone, because that was an attempt to say the past is a different country. We draw a line, we're not looking at these issues. And it simply doesn't work like that, because you have profound pain and hurt across communities in Northern Ireland. And I do feel when you look at any post-conflict society that actually, unless you have a truth and reconciliation type process, unless you have a way of looking back and understanding what happened, very, very difficult to move forward. So I think the past is not a different country for me, and it's a place we need to look at and we need to visit before you can move on.
Finally, Keelan, for a more reconciled Ireland, regardless of how it is constituted, what do we need to give and what might we gain in the years ahead?
So in terms of what we can gain, there's huge gains to be made. And I think we only need to look at just how profoundly altering the Good Friday Agreement was to all of our experiences and to this island as a whole. And there's huge amounts to be gained. In terms of what we can give, we've a lot to give. And I think that comes in various different layers. I think, of course, at a policy level and at a national level, I greatly welcome the thinking which is going on in the Irish government, thinking through potential contingencies, options, and the pragmatic nuts and bolts of what a more reconciled Ireland might look like. And that there are many different ways in which that could happen. But that's also thinking which we must see being developed in Westminster too, because at the moment I feel there's an asymmetry in terms of the level of thinking about those issues. But also just at a very human, individual level, I think we all need to start reflecting in a different way on identity and layered identity. So I've been critical earlier in this interview about my experiences of seeing kind of anti-Irish or unthinking anti-Irishness or ignorance just about Irish history or Irish politics or Irish structures that I sometimes experienced when I first moved over to London and to England. I do think we need to start thinking in a more enlightened way, in the same way that we expect that of others. We also need to do it ourselves too. And I think we at an individual level need to do that, as well as just expecting leadership to start thinking in a different way. We individually need to start thinking in a different way too, and thinking differently about what Irishness is and what identity is, and being able to work more closely together.
Keelan Gallagher, thank you very much.